You are not meant to sleep easily in a palace where the windows never open and the walls have learned to listen. You are not meant to breathe freely where each sigh might echo into judgment, where the scent of roses is outnumbered by the scent of powder and rot. You have heard the stories, haven't you? That Elizabeth I was England's most glorious queen, the virgin monarch, the iron-willed daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, a woman who defied kings and popes alike, who never married and never fell, who stood firm while empires trembled. But what if that isn't the whole truth? What if the crown she wore was not a symbol of power, but of fear, a glittering cage pressed down so tightly it left bruises across time? What if the Virgin Queen never slept? Not because she didn't want to, but because sleep meant surrender, and surrender was a kind of death. You must understand, when Elizabeth ascended the throne in the year 1558, she was only 25 years old, but already steeped in ghosts. She had seen her mother beheaded, heard her sister burn heretics, and learned early that love was a blade that could slice both ways. Her heart, once tender, had become a vault sealed with silence, and from that silence came rules. Not laws in the sense of parliament and parchment, but laws of the body, the eyes, the soul, laws that twisted through the air of her court like smoke through a locked room, laws that no one dared name aloud but all obeyed. The first of these was the most suffocating in Elizabeth's court. No one was allowed to fall in love. Not truly. Not without consequences. You were not to flirt too freely, to laugh too long with a certain man, to walk too slowly through the garden, if someone else's eyes lingered too warmly on yours. The Queen watched everything. Every glance was weighed, every touch suspected. If two courtiers grew close, rumors spread like fever, and soon enough, one would vanish. Some were exiled, some imprisoned, some simply disappeared, sent to distant lands under noble excuses. Their names left out of court records like they had never existed. You could not even be certain if the Queen was jealous, or simply afraid. It didn't matter. Her court became a place where romance withered under the gaze of a woman who could not bear to see love bloom unless it bloomed in her direction. The men she favoured, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex, were not lovers in the traditional sense, but prisoners of performance, walking tightropes of favour, held close and pushed away, again and again, until they forgot how it felt to breathe without watching her expression first. And so the palace fell quiet in strange ways. People still danced, yes, and laughed and played music, but they did so with carefully rehearsed restraint. They knew the law of the Queen's heart. Even if it was never carved into stone, you were allowed to adore her. You were allowed to admire her. But you were never allowed to belong to someone else more than you belonged to her image. Because Elizabeth ruled not just a nation, but the emotional oxygen of everyone around her, she did not merely want to be respected. She wanted to be irreplaceable. There is a kind of sleep that never comes. Even when your eyes are closed and your body is still. The Queen, they say, slept in such a way, always half alert, always sensing betrayal in the rustle of skirts and the hush of corridors. She surrounded herself with women who could not speak their minds, only their loyalties. She demanded not just silence, but devotion, not just obedience, but worship. It is said that no woman in her presence could dare to appear too radiant, too young, or too adored. Even the court's dresses were designed to mirror hers, just a little duller, just a little paler, as if to ensure she remained the sun in the center of a carefully managed solar system of lesser stars. And so you imagine it now, don't you? The great chamber with its tapestries and shadows, the air thick with candle wax and whispers, a courtier intus, a letter tucked into his glove. A glance is exchanged too long, a smile lingers too wide. Somewhere down the hall, a door closes softly, and you do not see that man again for months. When he returns, A's quieter. It does not smile so quickly. His eyes flick to the Queen before they land on anyone else. And you learn, silently, the first law of survival in Elizabeth's world. Do not love too loudly. And perhaps that is why you cannot sleep. Because you begin to wonder what it must have felt like to rule in this way, to be so admired and yet so utterly alone. To have every word measured, every portrait painted only with flattery, every man's gaze filtered through fear. Perhaps Elizabeth feared that if she ever let anyone close enough to truly know her, they would leave. Or worse, they would stay. And see her as she really was. Not the eternal virgin queen, but a mortal woman, aging, aching, unsure, desperate to matter, in a world that only pretended to listen. So as you lay here now, eyes soft in the darkness, you might ask yourself, was it worth it? The glory, the power, the golden legacy that school children memorize, did it ever fill the hollow inside her? Or did she lie awake, night after night, beneath silk sheets and painted ceilings, wondering if perhaps she had written laws not to rule others, but to keep herself from breaking? Close your eyes if you dare. But don't expect rest. Not in this story, because here, in the shadow of a throne too heavy for sleep, even silence has a voice, and it whispers her name. You must understand this. First, Elizabeth Tudor was not born in love, and perhaps that is why she never truly believed in it. She was conceived in ambition, born into scandal, and bathed not in the warmth of a mother's arms, but in the chill of political survival. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had once been the center of obsession and flattery, adored and envied, chased and worshipped. And then, with a single nod from a disappointed king, she was stripped of title, dignity, and life, beheaded in the year 1536. Anne's blood had barely dried when Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Her name was removed from succession. Her presence became inconvenient. And in that void of warmth, that childhood of careful speech and watched eyes, the seeds of something colder took root, a distrust so deep it rewrote how love would ever exist around her. So when she became queen in 1558, she brought with her not just the memory of betrayals past, but the iron rules she had learned from watching love devour those who dared reach for it. Elizabeth, crowned in a white dress, holding a Bible in one hand and the scepter of England in the other, declared herself married to her country. And at first, they thought it a metaphor. But as the years passed, it became a warning. You see, in her court, love was not simply discouraged. It was surveilled, suspected, smothered in silk and silence. For beneath the banquets and the poetry, the masked balls and the madrigals, there was a brutal reality. No one, no man, no woman was permitted to fall in love without the Queen's knowledge and, more importantly, her permission. And even then, permission was rarely granted. Every romantic glance risked a reprimand. Every whispered conversation in a garden risked being overheard by someone who owed their loyalty not to desire, but to the crown, in a palace where even your sigh might be reported. Intimacy became a dangerous game, and privacy became something one only dreamed about. The rule was never written into law, not formally, but it did not need ink or parchment to enforce it. It lived in the eyes of her ladies, who learned to laugh carefully, never too brightly. It echoed in the steps of the noblemen, who measured their compliments, fearful of stepping too close to beauty that did not belong to the Queen. It lived in the whispers of servants, in the sudden absence of a groom who had dared fall for a lady in waiting, or in the quiet exile of a girl whose cheeks had flushed too deeply in the presence of a visiting ambassador. The rule was this: love belonged to Elizabeth, and if it did not serve her, it could not survive. Perhaps the most tragic victim of this silent law was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's childhood friend, rumoured lover, and most intimate companion. Their bond was undeniable. They shared a history marked by loss and survival. They had known each other in the days when both were nobodies, she, the overlooked daughter of a disgraced queen, he, the second son of a traitor. Their friendship bloomed in the dangerous silence of the tower. And when Elizabeth became queen, she lifted Dudley with her. She gave him rooms next to hers. She walked with him in the gardens. She wrote him letters filled with longing and need. But she never gave him freedom. He was hers, and only hers. And though their closeness was the subject of gossip and court satire, she never allowed him to marry. When he secretly wed Lettice Knollys, Elizabeth's cousin, no less, the Queen erupted in fury. Lettice was banished. Dudley was humiliated. The wound never healed. For Elizabeth, it was not the betrayal of affection that cut deepest. It was the reminder that love could exist beyond her reach, that someone she cherished had dared give his heart to another woman. And so the walls tightened. Permission was required for every engagement, every flirtation. Courtiers began seeking approval for courtship, as if asking to borrow royal jewels. Some were denied with a cool smile. Others received silence as their answer. The Queen's court, once a place of poetry and wit, began to resemble a convent in its emotional repression. Love letters were intercepted. Messengers were bribed. Maids whispered secrets that could be sold for favour. And all the while, Elizabeth stood untouched, untouchable, her gowns growing heavier with each year, her face whiter with lead and powder, her gaze sharper, her laughter less frequent. You might wonder why she did this, why a woman so powerful, so intelligent, so admired, would wish to starve her court of the very thing that makes human life bearable. But imagine living in a world where every man you might love could use that love against you. Imagine knowing that every woman who bloomed in youth and beauty could become your rival, not just for affection, but for influence. Elizabeth had seen what happened to queens who loved unwisely. Catherine Howard, her cousin, beheaded for secrets, whispered behind closed doors. Jane Grey, the girl queen, loved by none, betrayed by all, even her own mother. Once Henry's obsession, discarded and executed like a broken doll. Elizabeth learned the lesson early. Affection was currency, and currency could be stolen. The only safe kind of love was the one you controlled completely. But the price was steep. Her court aged with her. The young lovers grew cautious. Then cold. Marriages became strategic, not affectionate. Poems praised the Queen, not each other. And the palace, once filled with music and games, echoed more often with silence. Some said the Queen found comfort in this control, that it was proof of her strength. But others whispered that in her private moments, Elizabeth grew lonelier each year, that she kept portraits of Dudley long after his death, that she would sometimes sit in the dark, rereading old letters, that she envied the very thing she forbade. By the end of her reign, few dared disobey the unwritten law. Those who married without her blessing did so in secret, trembling. Those who dared to love openly risked exile or disgrace. And still, Elizabeth never spoke of this law aloud. She did not need to. It was etched into the way people moved around her. It was carved into the expressions of her ladies, trained to smile at her triumphs, but never too brightly at anyone else's. It was inked into the eyes of her men, who dared not linger too long on any beauty but hers. She had outlawed love, and in doing so, had ensured her crown would be worshipped, but never truly shared. So now, as you lie still and let your breath soften in the dark, consider what kind of sleep follows a life built on such rules. Not the restful kind, surely. Not the sleep of a woman held gently in a lover's arms, soothed by trust. No, Elizabeth's sleep must have been shallow, broken, haunted. Each night a reminder that to rule hearts, She had to deny her own, that to remain untouched. She had to remain unloved, that in choosing the crown, she had chosen to be alone, even in her dreams. And perhaps, even now, her shadow walks those same corridors, listening for the sound of laughter in the dark, and whispering to the walls, "No one loves without my leave." There is a kind of terror that arrives, not with blood or betrayal, but with the slow unfurling of time across the skin, the quiet shifting of shadows beneath the eyes, the brittle edge to a once commanding voice. In the world of queens and crowns, where portraits lie and courtiers flatter, age is not simply a reminder of mortality, it is a threat to power itself. And so it was that Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, the woman who had outlived popes, kings, and lovers, waged her fiercest battle, not against foreign invaders or domestic plots, but against the mirror that dared reflect her as she truly was. You must understand, she had once been radiant, the golden-haired girl with clever eyes and a voice like silver lace, quick to charm and quicker to survive. As a young queen, she was the center of every room, the subject of countless poems, the face on every coin. And she had learned early that beauty was not simply a gift, it was a weapon. It disarmed ambassadors, silenced rivals, enchanted the people. But weapons, like roses, wither, and Elizabeth could not allow hers to dull in public, even as time carved its truth behind her eyes. And so she created a world where mirrors became dangerous things. It began subtly, a refusal to sit for portraits without strict approval of the final image. Then came the veils, the careful placement of jewels to distract from tired skin, the exaggerated collars that framed her face like a fortress. The paints grew heavier, the rouge more theatrical, the wigs taller, wider, like barriers of hair, to protect the fragile woman beneath. The queen no longer appeared in daylight unless carefully prepared. Her image became ritual, costume, illusion. But that was not enough. As the years passed and her body began to betray her, her teeth rotting, her hair falling, her skin mottled beneath the white lead, she imposed new laws. Silent but ruthless. All portraits of the queen must be approved by her ministers. No unauthorized images were to circulate. Artists who dared paint her too real were punished, their work destroyed. Only the mask of youth was permitted, the idealized face that never aged. The version of Elizabeth who remained forever 30, untouched by time or sorrow. The portraits became not reflections, but propaganda. To the outside world, the queen was eternal. Inside her chambers, the truth rotted quietly. Servants were forbidden from commenting on her appearance. Courtiers knew better than to flinch at her aging hands or bloodshot eyes. The mirror itself, once a symbol of beauty, became a threat. Some whispered that she had them removed from her chambers entirely. Others said she smashed one in fury after catching her reflection unguarded. What mattered was the rule reality must bend to her image. No one was to speak of wrinkles. No one was to notice the tremble in her fingers or the way her breath grew shallow after long speeches. But perhaps the cruelest part was how this illusion shaped the women around her. Her ladies-in-waiting, once bright with youth and laughter, were subtly reshaped to fit the queen's needs. None were to outshine her. Dresses were muted, jewelry modest. No one was to wear colors she disapproved of. Those who bloomed too brightly were quietly removed. And still, the queen demanded loyalty, not just political, but aesthetic. You were to reflect her beauty back to her, even if it no longer existed. You were to pretend she had not aged, even as you grew old beside her. And yet, beneath all this artifice, you can almost feel the ache, the slow, gnawing grief of a woman watching herself disappear. For Elizabeth was not blind. She knew the truth. She could feel it in her bones, in the stiffness of her knees, in the soft wheeze that followed her laughter. She had become a symbol, and symbols cannot afford to decay. But she, unlike her portrait, was flesh, and flesh betrays. So she doubled down. In the final decade of her life, the queen appeared less and less. When she did, she was a ghost of herself. Towering wigs, painted face, skirts heavy enough to crush a lesser woman, and behind her eyes, fury, not at her people, not even at the passing of time, but at the injustice of being remembered only through the lie she had built. She had made the mirror her enemy, and in doing so, had made herself a stranger. You wonder, don't you, what she saw in the moments she was alone, when the paint cracked and the silence returned. Did she mourn the girl she once was, the laughing princess in green velvet, dancing through the gardens of her childhood? Or did she whisper to herself that this was victory, that to be remembered as beautiful, even falsely, was better than being forgotten altogether? But perhaps, in those last lonely hours, when the candlelight flickered and no courtiers dared enter, she saw not the version painted by court artists, nor the frightened reflection hidden behind powders, but simply a woman, tired, aging, afraid. A woman who had ruled with brilliance, yes, but also with illusion. And in that illusion, she had trapped herself. Sleep does not come easily to queens who fight mirrors, because no matter how deep the silence, the truth always returns. In shadows, in silver, in dreams, there is a kind of silence that weighs more than any scream. It's the silence of a name that is no longer spoken. The silence of a chair left empty at court. The silence of blood washed quickly from stone floors before sunrise. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, loyalty was not a request. It was a rule written not in ink, but in fear, and when that rule was broken, the punishment came swiftly, wrapped not in noise, but in a quiet so final. It echoed down generations. You are not safe in the presence of a monarch who trusts no one. You are not safe, even if she smiles at you in the morning, takes your hand at a banquet, praises your poetry before the court. Because in Elizabeth's world, favour was a mask that could crack without warning. She had learned young that betrayal wears the face of a friend. Had she not watched courtiers praise her mother one day and witness her execution the next? Had she not lived through her own imprisonment under her sister, where the wrong word might mean death, trust? For Elizabeth was a currency too expensive to spend, and when it failed, she did not hesitate to collect the cost. The court of Elizabeth was a performance, and all were actors on a stage where the script could change without notice. One day, you might be the Queen's confidante, whispering secrets behind embroidered fans. The next, you were under arrest, your house raided, your letters seized, your friends suddenly hard to find. No trial needed, no confrontation, just silence. Her most dangerous weapon was not the sword, it was doubt. Once the Queen doubted your loyalty, your days were already numbered. Take, for instance, the poet and courtier Sir Walter Raleigh. Brilliant, ambitious, beloved by many, and yet too clever for his own safety. He dared to love without permission, dared to rise too high, too fast. He had Elizabeth's ear, her laughter, even perhaps her heart. But when he married one of her ladies in waiting in secret, without asking leave, the Queen's fury was swift. He was thrown into the tower, his wife disgraced, though he would be restored later. The crack in trust never fully healed. And years later, he would lose his head, quite literally, under another monarch's sword. But the silence had begun with Elizabeth. Once she turned away from you, it was only a matter of time before the world did too. But it was not just men of ambition who learned this lesson. Women, too, were expected to live and die by the Queen's code. One step too far, one whisper too loud, One compliment too well received. From the wrong lips and your fate was sealed. Banishment was common, exile more merciful than death. Yet even in exile, the queen's reach was long. Those who once basked in her light often found that without it, the world grew very cold. And yet, the most terrifying punishments were not always visible. They were the ones that happened in corners of the palace where no one was allowed to go. In dark corridors where guards stood without speaking. In cells beneath the stone where the air was too thin and time did not pass. These were the places where loyalty was tested not with questions, but with silence. No records remain of all who vanished. Only rumors. The chambermaid who knew too much. The secretary who read one letter too carefully. The cousin who asked too many questions about the queen's younger years. Gone. Not with spectacle, but with quiet precision. You may wonder how Elizabeth justified this to herself. But to her, it was simple. To rule was to survive. And to survive, one must demand absolute loyalty. Anything less was treason. She had watched too many thrones fall to whispering tongues. Too many kingdoms crumble under the weight of divided allegiance. She would not be one of them. And so she made loyalty into law. And that law had no room for error. Even her spy master, the cunning Francis Walsingham, understood that fear was the Queen's most effective tool. He built a network of surveillance that would shame modern intelligence agencies, letters intercepted, rooms listened to, servants bribed, codes broken. Nothing escaped his attention. And all of it was for her. Because the greatest threat to Elizabeth's reign was not war, it was disloyalty whispered behind her back. And yet, what happens to a woman who builds her kingdom on fear? What does it cost to demand unwavering devotion from people who tremble when you enter the room over time? The Queen became surrounded by flatterers. Not friends. Courtiers who smiled, but watched their words. Servants who bowed, but avoided her eyes. And in that perfect silence, she had engineered. The Queen was utterly alone. By the end of her life, Elizabeth wandered the halls of her palaces like a ghost. Those she had once loved were gone dead, disgraced, or simply worn down. She slept less. She spoke less. She stared longer into the distance, as if waiting for someone who never came. Loyalty had protected her. Yes, but it had also isolated her. There were no daughters to whisper goodnight. No husband to sit beside her fire. Only portraits. And silence, tonight, as you pull the blanket tighter and feel the breath rise and fall in your chest. Ask yourself what it means to be loyal, and at what point loyalty becomes fear. Because in Elizabeth's world, even love was suspicious. Even memory could be dangerous. And the only safe way to live was to keep your heart quiet, your hands steady, and your voice silent. The executioner rarely needed to speak. The Queen had already said enough. You may think that the most protected place in a palace is the throne room, or the treasury, or the council chamber where maps are rolled and fates are sealed with wax. But in truth, it is the bedchamber, the one room where a ruler closes her eyes, where the body forgets power and longs only to rest, where masks are shed and silence becomes not a tool but a companion. But for Queen Elizabeth I, even the sanctuary of her bed was not allowed to become soft. It was a place of rules, of rituals, of suspicion, and of solitude, carefully designed to keep her sovereign, even in sleep. From the moment she rose to power, Elizabeth made it clear that her body was not public property. She had watched too many women, noble and common alike, lose their voices once they were touched. She had seen how queens became pawns through marriage, how alliances made in bed could become daggers in daylight. And so she claimed her body not only as her own, but as the kingdom's. She would not marry. She would not bear children. She would not lie beside a man who could ever call her his. The English throne, she declared, had a bride already, and she was it. But even that famous declaration, "I am married to England," was more than symbolism. It became the blueprint for her private life. Her bedchamber, far from being a place of softness, became a carefully guarded theatre of control. The door to her room was never left unwatched. Her ladies-in-waiting rotated on schedule. No one entered unannounced. And though rumours swirled for decades about Dudley, about courtier, about nights where candles burned too long, nothing was ever proven. Because Elizabeth never let herself be caught asleep. Metaphorically, or otherwise, sleep. For here was not a surrender. It was a risk. And risks were not allowed. Every pillow was fluffed to exactness. Every coverlet was straightened twice. Her nightgowns were inspected for wear and tear, for stains, for signs of weakness. Her physicians checked the temperature of her room. Her bedposts were carved high and austere, not with vines or cherubs, but with Tudor roses, symbols of legitimacy, not love. And when she finally lay down, she did so like a soldier setting foot on a battlefield, prepared, composed, alert beneath the layers of lace. She did not sleep deeply, not in youth, not in age, not after the threats, the letters laced with poison, the daggers found beneath tapestries. She had seen too much to close her eyes fully. Her servants knew to speak softly, to move slowly. Any abrupt sound in the middle of the night could send her upright, breathing heavy, one hand gripping the edge of the bed, as if expecting someone, perhaps her past, perhaps here, enemies, perhaps even herself, to emerge from the dark. And then there were the rules of touch. No one touched the Queen without permission, not even her most trusted ladies. Helping her dress was a privilege, not a routine. Combing her hair was a ritual, not a gesture of intimacy. Even in illness, Elizabeth resisted the gentle hand. She would not be seen vulnerable, not even when her joints ached or her breath grew shallow. She had mastered the art of stillness, of sitting through pain without wincing, of enduring headaches behind her white powdered mask, of never flinching when her body betrayed her. And so her bed, the one place meant to hold a person in their weakness, became instead the final stage, where she performed strength. Some nights, her ladies reported, she would sit up long after midnight, eyes open, unblinking. She would stare into nothing, or perhaps into the fading shadows of memories long buried. When they begged her to rest, she would shake her head and say, "Not yet," as if even sleep needed her permission, as if dreams, too, must be governed by the crown. And perhaps they were, for if ever a woman could command her own dreams, it was Elizabeth. She had lived her entire life, editing the world's vision of her. Why should sleep be different? But the cost was high. Sleep, when it came, was restless. Her sheets were often found tangled, her nightdress soaked with sweat. Some said she whispered in sleep names, dates, forgotten lines from plays. Others claimed she muttered to someone long gone. Perhaps her mother. Perhaps Dudley. Perhaps the girl she once was. But always, she woke alone. Even the rituals surrounding her waking were acts of defense. Her face was never seen unpainted by anyone who was not sworn to silence. Her hair, thinned by age and powder, was hidden beneath elaborate wigs before breakfast. She would not eat in public until she had donned her armor gowns of velvet, jewels like shields, lace like borders, no one could cross. All of it designed to erase the vulnerability of the night before. But there is something unbearably human about a bed. No matter how many guards you place at the door, how many rules you write in gold, a bed remembers. It remembers weight, pressure, warmth. It remembers tears, cried into pillows, laughter muffled under covers, the scent of dreams lost and never spoken aloud. And Elizabeth's bed, too, must have remembered her. It must have remembered the nights when she curled on her side, facing the wall. Her crown left not on a cushion, but on a stool nearby, close enough to grab, too heavy to ignore. It must have remembered the quiet sobs she never let anyone hear. It must have felt the stiffness in her limbs as she grew older, the way she clutched her stomach when pain came in waves, the silence that stretched longer each winter. It must have known her more truly than anyone else in her court ever did. And in the end, when death finally entered, it was the bed that bore witness. She refused it for days, standing rather than lying down, fearful that once she did, she would never rise again. And she was right. When she finally allowed herself to rest, she sank not just into linen, but into history, alone, as she had chosen, as she had lived. So tonight, as you pull your own blankets close, I think not of the power she held, but of the space she never shared. Think of the warmth denied, the hands never held, the comfort refused again and again, until the body forgot what it meant to be touched gently. Her bed was a battlefield, and though she won, it was not a victory of peace, it was a victory of silence. And even now, centuries later, perhaps her spirit still paces the edges of the bed, still watching, still waiting, still refusing to close her eyes. There comes a moment in every life when the body begins to speak more loudly than the will, when the fingers no longer close with strength, when breath comes with a wheeze too slight for courtiers to comment on, but too persistent for the queen herself to ignore, when mirrors are no longer shattered out of anger, but avoided out of mercy. And for Elizabeth Tudor, who had ruled for more than 4 decades, with iron painted in white lead and well dressed in pearls, that moment came not with a thunderclap, but with a stain that would not wash away. It began slowly, as all slow deaths do, a stiffness in the legs, a shadow under the skin, small bruises that took longer to fade, a mouth that no longer tasted food the same way, a voice that cracked not from grief but from dryness that no tonic could soothe. Her doctors called it natural decline, her ladies called it exhaustion, but in the silence of her chambers, Elizabeth knew another truth. Something inside her was rotting. The years of white lead make up the thick, poisonous paste she wore daily to preserve the illusion of youth had begun to seep beneath the surface. Her skin, once masked to perfection, now cracked in patches too deep for powder to hide. Beneath her carefully curled wigs, her real hair had grown thin, brittle, and patchy. Her teeth, long a source of quiet shame, now ached behind closed lips. Some had fallen out, others blackened at the root. When she smiled, which became rarer each year, it was with the mouth closed. And then came the odor, faint at first, just a note of sourness beneath the perfume. But perfume cannot mask everything, and those who stood too close, those who helped her undress, began to notice. The queen's body no longer smelled like rose oil and lavender. It smelled of damp cloth, of iron, of something more intimate, the beginning of decay. She heard the whispers before they were ever spoken aloud. Elizabeth's court was trained in discretion, but the eyes of her servants could not lie. They winced when they brushed her arms, where her skin sometimes peeled without warning. They hesitated when changing her linens, which was stained not just with sweat, but with something darker, something viscous, something that no one dared name. And so she responded, the only way she knew how she hid. She tightened the rules around her presence, limited public appearances, forbade anyone but her most trusted to attend her dressing. Her gowns became even more elaborate, layered not just with fabric, but with secrecy, high collars to hide the fragile neck, long sleeves to disguise the mottled arms, gloves, always, even in warmth. At one point, it was said she refused to sleep, lying down, afraid. Perhaps that her body would settle into death before she was ready. She stood for hours, propped against cushions, refusing to close her eyes, refusing to appear weak. She would not be remembered as fragile. Not her, not Gloriana, not the Virgin Queen who had faced down the Armada and danced through rebellions with grace. She would be remembered whole, or not at all. And so the performance continued, even as her body failed her in secret, even as her feet swelled and cracked, even as her gums bled silently, even as her stool turned dark and tar-like, even as her back ached so severely she could no longer bend without help. She never let the court see her falter. She never let a gasp escape when pain knifed through her belly. She never cried out. Not once. When the abscess near her jaw began to ooze, some say the Queen had ulcers inside her mouth, deep ones that festered with infection. Others claim her bowels had begun to fail, that the stench was not from the air, but from the Queen herself, leaking from within, dying inch by inch while still alive, a body embalming itself in real time. But no one could say for sure, because Elizabeth, even in decline, controlled the narrative. She forbade any detailed records of her final illness. Physicians were sworn to silence. Notes destroyed. Only vague references remain. She rests. She grows tired. She speaks little now. But what they meant was, she is fading. From the inside out, one of her closest ladies wrote, years later, that the Queen's body had grown so thin it no longer warmed the sheets, that when she was undressed, her bones jutted like iron bars beneath a decaying tapestry, that her skin had turned the color of parchment, that her breathing came in rattles, that her breath, once perfumed and sharp, now reeked of copper and clove and something fouler, the scent of organs beginning to betray their queen. Still, no public word was given, no announcement, no mourning robe prepared. The country believed she was simply aging, that the Queen was still strong, still ruling, still radiant in her gowns and pearls. But inside the palace, candles burned late into the night. Doctors were summoned in secret. Priests waited in chambers nearby. Uninvited, Elizabeth would not allow them near. Not yet. She was not ready to be absolved, because she had one final command to fulfill to die, as she had lived untouchable, unseeable, and above all, undiminished. When death finally came, it was not with a scream, but with silence. She stopped speaking, refused to lie in bed, stood for hours until her legs buckled. And even then, she did not cry out. When she was finally placed upon her mattress, the bed she had avoided for days, she whispered nothing, not even farewell. And so the Queen, who had hidden every wound, every scar, every crack in her porcelain mask, passed into legend, with her secrets still sealed. But the skin beneath the crown remembers, the skin that cracked under paint, the skin that burned with fever, the skin that ached to be touched one last time, not as a monarch, but as a woman, and tonight, as your own body rests, soft and unjudged beneath the blankets. Perhaps you can feel a ghost nearby, not of a queen, but of a woman who spent a lifetime hiding everything except her silence. A silence that, even now, smells faintly of roses, and something else. They said the moment her breath left her body, the palace stilled as though God himself had drawn a curtain across the world. Not a trumpet sounded. Not a bell was rung. The walls, once lined with whispers and wine and velvet shoes sliding across marble, fell mute. The courtiers who had once fought to stand closest to her now stood frozen at a distance, as if the room where she died had turned to stone, as if the air itself had grown heavy with a silence that no one dared disturb. The Queen was gone, and the silence that followed was not just quiet, it was deliberate. It was sacred. It was terrifying. For 44 years, Elizabeth had been England. Her voice had commanded armies, broken alliances, and conjured loyalty from men who had vowed themselves to no one but ambition. But now her voice had stopped. And what lingered in the air was not grief in the way the world had expected, not weeping in the corridors or howls of despair, but something stranger, an eerie stillness, as if mourning her meant unraveling everything she had kept intact with force and fear and sheer unrelenting presence. They covered the mirrors in her chamber first, not out of tradition, but because even her reflection seemed untrustworthy now. It was said the final days had warped her features' eyes too wide. Mouth drawn tight, skin pulled against bone like parchment, stretched too long in the sun. Her ladies-in-waiting, who had once clothed her in jewels and silks, now approached her with gloves and trembling hands. The room had the smell of wax and lavender, and something more pungent, something they would never name in official records, but that haunted their dresses for weeks afterward. Her body, already frail, had begun to turn, slowly at first, as if reluctant to betray her even in death. But the process could not be denied. The swelling of the belly, the colour of the lips, the seeping from the lower back. She had refused anointing, refused confession, refused to die in bed like a woman. But in the end, the body obeys no crown, and now they were left with a corpse, too powerful to bury and too decayed to preserve. There were arguments hushed and venomous about what to do next. Some wanted to embalm her as swiftly as possible, though the inner rot had made that difficult. Others wanted to dress her and display her in the throne room. But who could stand the sight? Who could look upon the face that had once dazzled Spain and France and Scotland and not see the hollowness that now consumed it? They compromised. A closed coffin, cedarwood lined with pitch and perfumes, sealed before the court could gather. Her body was not to be seen, not because they feared her, but because they feared what she had become. Not Gloriana, not the Virgin Queen, not Bess of the Armada, but a woman, old and broken, whose last act was to vanish behind a curtain of silence. The funeral procession was planned in whispers. The bells that had once pealed for victory now tolled in single, heavy notes, long and low. Like breaths held too long beneath water, the streets were lined with citizens, but they did not cheer, nor chant, nor wail. They watched in reverent stillness, hats clutched in calloused hands. Children held quiet against their mothers' skirts. Because how do you mourn a woman who had become a myth? How do you cry for someone who had ruled so long that even God seemed to have taken his cues from her? And so the grief came not in noise, but in absence. The absence of her voice at court, the absence of her footfall in the garden, the absence of her shadow at the window, where once she had stood, framed by candlelight, watching the world and daring it to defy her. Servants passed one another in halls without speaking. Courtiers paused before opening doors, half expecting to find her behind them. The chapel was full, but no one sang. James was crowned, not long after. A new reign, a new order. But even he knew what he inherited was not merely a throne, it was a ghost. A legacy too large to sit beside. In every room of Whitehall, in every corridor of Greenwich, there lingered the scent of powder, the echo of silks, the silence that followed a woman who had made herself more than human and had died alone anyway. Some said the birds flew lower those weeks, that the River Thames moved more slowly, that the wind shifted. Others claimed she still walked the halls at night, that her final breath never fully left the palace, that her silence became part of the stone. And perhaps it did, because silence, when worn long enough, does not vanish. It settles. It becomes a veil, a second skin, a national memory stitched into the fabric of dusk. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you know this silence does not mean the end. Not when it follows a crown. It means reckoning. It means remembrance. It means everything that was never spoken now floats in the dark, waiting for ears brave enough to listen. Long after the Queen was gone, long after her coffin had vanished into the damp stone belly of Westminster, Long after her pearls were packed away and her wigs left to wilt in cedar-lined vaults, her presence did not soften. It sharpened, and in place of her breath, there remained the breath of law, thin as cobweb, but strong as steel, etched into parchment, echoed in courtrooms, repeated in frightened whispers by those who had never even seen her face. These were not the kind of laws carved in stone or argued in council chambers. These were not declarations made for Parliament to cheer or clergy to bless. These were the laws of presence, of silence, of fear, and most of all, they were laws about what must not be said, what must never be questioned, and what must never again be seen. The first was simple. No one was to speak of the Queen's body. Not in jest, not in memory, not in curiosity. It was forbidden to describe how she looked in her final year. Forbidden to mention her frailty. Forbidden to recall the stench that clung to her bedchamber, or the colour her skin had turned. Servants who had cared for her in those final days were made to swear oaths of silence. Physicians were warned. Artists were watched. There would be no woodcut of the Queen in death, no drawing of her fingers curled inward, no sketch of the cracked lips or the bruises that blossomed across her chest like violets of rot. In the court of James, this silence was inherited like a haunted jewel, polished, revered, and never touched. And yet, this silence itself became a rule, one that lasted longer than the Queen's reign. No monarch after her would be drawn without approval. No sovereign's aging face would appear without correction. No ruler, especially no queen, would be allowed to decay in public again. The idea of royal decay, once witnessed behind the veil of Elizabeth's final months, was banished from English consciousness. It was as if the Queen's final gift was a blueprint, how to be immortal by refusing to die, even when the flesh had already surrendered. But there were stranger laws. One forbade anyone from keeping personal portraits of her that had not been cleansed. These were to be destroyed. And many were. Whole galleries were emptied of paintings where her eyes looked too sunken, where the chin sagged, where the mouth appeared drawn and humorless. Even after her death, the mask of youth remained the only legal version of her face, and artists who disobeyed were met with consequences, loss of license, loss of favour, and in one case, quiet imprisonment. Another law, never written but strictly enforced, forbade any woman in court from claiming to resemble her. Flattery was one thing, but to publicly compare oneself to Elizabeth was seen as imitation, and imitation was near blasphemy. The Queen had been made into a myth, and myths are not to be copied. More than once, noble women were dismissed from court after being painted in dresses that too closely resembled Elizabeth's famous gowns. In these stories, it was said their portraits were slashed down the middle. Others claimed the Queen's ghost demanded it. There were laws, too, about movement. The Queen had famously paced her chambers in patterns 25 steps forward, 5 steps to turn, 25 back. After her death, it became a superstition among palace staff that to walk those same steps at the same time of day would invite illness, or visions, or worse. Some said a maid collapsed while doing so. Some said her lips turned white and she whispered, "She is still here." And then there were the laws of sound. The palace musicians were forbidden to play certain pieces, Elizabeth's favourite madrigals, her coronation theme, the lute songs she had once hummed. These were placed under sorrowful silence, as if to unseal them would awaken something, and perhaps it would. Because Elizabeth had never ruled only by law, she had ruled by atmosphere, by mood, by unspoken command, and that did not die with her breath. Even decades later, during the reign of Charles and the tumults of civil war, the silence lingered in the halls where she had once stood. It became part of the stone, a hush that outlived gunfire, a shadow that outlived plague, and the strangest law of all, that the Queen had never truly died. Not in the eyes of those who whispered, They said she had simply changed shape, that she had entered the very structure of England itself, that her silence had become law, that her refusal to rot had infected the very bones of the monarchy. So when a young maid leaned too closely to the fire and swore she heard her name spoken in Elizabeth's voice, no one laughed. When a portrait was moved and a crack appeared where her eye had once been, no one touched it. When a child born in the shadow of Whitehall refused to speak until the age of 7 and then only said, "She watches," no one corrected him, because silence, when enforced long enough, does not fade, it rules. And the queen who had turned mirrors into liars, who had painted youth over death, who had outlawed age and buried herself beneath perfume and pearl, had also left behind a country that feared its own reflection. Tonight, as you lie still in the soft dark, you may think of kings and queens and centuries gone, and you may feel far from it all, untouched, safe. But if ever you pass through a hall where no one speaks, where the candles flicker for no wind, where portraits watch you with eyes a little too knowing, you might remember some laws are not written in ink, but in silence, and silence, after all, was always her sharpest crown. There are monarchs remembered for their wars, and there are monarchs remembered for their peace. But then, there are those remembered for something else entirely, for the space they left behind. The silence that followed them like a veil. The stillness that was more commanding than any roar. Elizabeth was one of them. Or perhaps she was the only one. She did not raise her voice often, but when she did, the world bent. And when she stopped speaking, the world listened harder. Hers was not a reign of thunder or revolution, but of pause, of careful glances, of held breath. As the final candle flickers in the palace of your thoughts tonight, let your eyes fall heavy on the image of a queen, not in armor, not in velvet, not even on a throne, but alone, upright in a cold bed, surrounded by shadows that bow deeper than any man. She outlived them all. The men who courted her, the women who envied her, the poets who wrote verses to please her, the traitors who thought they could frighten her, even the ghosts of her own past. And yet, what did she win? Power? Yes. Control? Yes. A country carved to her image, but also silence. The kind of silence that doesn't end when you die but grows louder, takes shape, becomes custom, then law, then myth. It is tempting to believe that silence is soft, but hers was not. Hers was structured, measured, sharpened by fear and obsession and the ache of being watched without ever truly being seen. She turned absence into authority, turned distance into discipline, turned her body into a battlefield where no one was allowed to land a blow until decay, quiet and patient, finally claimed its place beneath her crown. Still, she did not surrender to rot the way others did. She erased it, hid it, wrote it out of the story, even in death. She did not permit her body to speak the language of weakness. Perhaps that is why England wept without wailing, why her name was whispered for decades but not sung, why her portraits remain blank-eyed, always watching, never aging, never forgiving. She had taught them all that beauty could be legislated, that memory could be edited, and that silence could rule. And so now, you sleep in a world touched by her echo. When you pause before speaking in a room full of strangers, when you hesitate to show pain, even when it claws beneath your ribs, when you look in the mirror and wonder whether to soften or to harden, you are, in some small and distant way, meeting her shadow. Because Elizabeth did not just shape a court, or a government, or an empire. She shaped the very idea of how a woman might disappear while remaining present in every room, every law, every hush. Tonight, she does not knock on the door. She does not enter your dreams with blood or fire or crown. She simply stands, a figure in a far hallway, watching, waiting, her hands folded, her mouth closed. And in that silence, you understand the final lesson, that sometimes the most terrifying power is not rage, not cruelty, not even death, but silence, the kind that makes the whole world lean in and never, ever breathe again. Sleep well. She is listening,